Hello everyone, my name is Trevor, I go by TheMrTrails, and welcome to the channel. So you've probably at some point in your time in Dauntless at least visited the training grounds area. The main purpose of the training grounds is to provide an area away from the behemoths for new players to be able to practice combat movements, their combos, and get a feel for all of the weapons in the game. Once you've grown up as a slayer, there's only one thing that might keep you going back to the training grounds every now and then. That is the DPS, or damage per second meter. In a game in which the endgame is as central and focused around DPS as Dauntless is, having some way of measuring DPS is obviously a good thing. However, when it comes to Dauntless, there are a lot of factors that are keeping the current DPS meter from telling the whole truth. In today's video, we're going to be talking about some of the reasons that measuring DPS in the training grounds of Dauntless is not as helpful and straightforward as it may seem. If you enjoy, consider liking the video, and if you enjoy Dauntless content, consider subscribing to the channel. Here I post Dauntless content every week. And here's the famous analytic that magically gets everyone to subscribe. Alright, but there is a lot of watch time coming from people who are not subscribed, and if you're one of those people, consider becoming a subscriber. I heard a rumor that my subscribers get an extra 200 damage per second no matter what weapon is equipped. So let's get into it, and for starters, we'll take a look at one of the more straightforward topics of the training grounds as a whole. Just to note that currently there's a bug where you can't see the dealt part damage or wound damage in the training grounds, but we'll only need to look at the core damage per second for this video anyway. One of the reasons that this isn't a great place to test damage per second is that these are not actual behemoths. The training dummies are just in a permanent state of sitting there doing nothing. Most of these sources of damage in Dauntless are conditional, meaning that they require a certain circumstance to happen to grant you their damage. These conditional damage sources can require you, the player, to do something, or it can require the behemoth to do something. And when it comes to measuring your damage per second in the training grounds, this spells a major problem for three cells in particular: Aether Hunter, Rage Hunter, and Overpower. Aether Hunter grants you damage when a behemoth is Aether charged, and training dummies cannot Aether charge. Rage Hunter grants you damage when a behemoth is enraged. Training dummies cannot enrage. And Overpower grants you damage when a behemoth is in most states of being stunned, including staggers, interrupts, part break animations, and shock elemental procs. But the problem is, training dummies cannot be staggered, training dummies cannot be interrupted, training dummies cannot have their parts broken, and you wanna say it for me? Training dummies cannot receive the shock elemental proc. So the main issue that all of these cells cause is that they don't actually contribute anything to the damage per second meter of the training grounds, when in real situations it would contribute some amount of damage. Aether Hunter is the least relevant of these, at least at the time of recording this video. For the most part, even in a Dauntless trial setting, most behemoths will be killed before they're given the chance to Aether charge. Even if they do so right away, like Riftstalker does for example, there are actions that will instantly remove the Aether charge states from the behemoths. Rage Hunter is a tad bit more relevant. Again, there are a multitude of situations where behemoths, even in Dauntless trials, aren't given the opportunity to enrage. However, there are still certain circumstances in which the behemoth enraging is not preventable, or even where you might want to let the behemoth enrage to actually be able to deal some extra damage. Though, since the Frenzy Tonic already has a built-in version of Rage Hunter, having the Frenzy Tonic is usually enough. But when it comes to Overpower, this problem with the training dummies becomes a lot more relevant. In many situations, and again, even in Dauntless trials, it is possible to keep a behemoth in a constant state of stun locking between staggers, part breaks, and interrupts. It'll register though on the DPS meter in the training grounds as providing no additional benefit to a build, but in reality it can provide its 60% damage increase for over 90% of a behemoth's HP bar in some cases. With it being active for so long, it can easily constitute over 20% or even more of the total damage output in such scenarios, depending on the rest of the build. And if you were to use the DPS meter to decide what build to use, you'd be completely missing out on Overpower as an option for the build, even though it's usually a must-have. Next up, we've got the topic of crits. Critical strikes, crits for short, behave in Dauntless as they do in many other games. It's it's a chance occurrence to deal additional damage. Getting a crit will deal a base of a 1.5 times damage multiplier, which can be increased through a few methods. Using the cunning cell at +6 will give you a 1.8 times damage crit multiplier, and the aspect of the warrior passive in frost escalation will give you an extra 10 to 20% of this, making your multiplier 2 times by running cunning while being the avatar of destruction. And a previous method to increase this crit damage multiplier was the Granny's Heartbreaker tonic, which gave you 25% crit damage, and when used with Catalyst this would be 40%. The main issue with crits in Dauntless is that for the majority of builds you will not be able to guarantee landing a critical strike. For most builds you are going to be looking at a crit chance of 2% to 27% if we don't add any additional escalation amps or the Avatar of Destruction. But since crits are a chance occurrence, they will happen at random, and the problem this causes when testing whether or not a build or particular weapon is good is because your damage is then random to some degree. If you tested an axe build with a 10% crit chance, for 50,000 damage you could very realistically expect to get a test where you might crit 15, maybe even 20% of the time. Say that it takes you about 40 hits to get to that 50,000 damage. You could expect to get 8 or more of your hits to be critical strikes about 4% of the time. But you could also expect to get 2 or fewer of your hits to be critical strikes 22% of the time. If you take a look at just one damage test, you aren't going to be able to be sure whether or not this would be the amount of average damage the build actually does. Did I crit a normal amount of times? Did I crit way too much, or did I not crit at all? If you aren't actively able to factor out the crits from your testing, then you need to do hundreds or thousands of tests between separate builds to be able to prove that one build is better than another. Say that you high roll a lot of crits on build A, but you low rolled and got no crits on build B. The builds could give you results of hundreds of damage per second apart, even if without the crits being a factor, they might perform the same. There's one rather helpful thing you can do in the training grounds to help compensate for crits slightly. You can equip the discipline cell, close your equipment menu to activate discipline, then unequip discipline, and you should still be at half HP. This is very helpful if you need to compare a build with Rage or Wild Frenzy, but don't want to take on the extra crit chance that discipline provides. But if you've taken the extra crit chance node from the Slayer's Path though, you'd have to go for a test pass where you'd crit on 0 of your hits to perform an adequate test comparison. Well, if non-guaranteed crits are a problem, why don't we use a build where we have guaranteed crits? The problem still exists if you are using a Tenacious build. It's just instead of potentially getting crits on 20% of your hits while you're building up your crit chance, you could realistically still be getting about 80% crits. And that could be even if your build is only at around 60 or 70% crit chance at the time. And I've actually seen quite a few people do this and misinterpret how good Tenacious builds are, but you can't judge the damage per second output of a Tenacious build when you already have 100% crit chance. Because unless you are running Cascade or someone on your team is running Cascade, you will never enter a fight with 100% crit chance. And even then, you will have to be on the island for a considerable amount of time before you will enter a fight with 100% crit chance. Moving on though, we've got the factor that you can't use Tonics in the training grounds. Low HP builds in particular receive a major benefit from using the Blitz Tonic, since the Blitz Tonic grants more attack speed based on how low your HP is. This also makes Catalyst not a usable cell in the training grounds, when in reality it far outpaces every other utility cell when tonics are involved. Another issue is how power factors into the amount of damage you deal. Since from fight to fight you won't always be able to have the same power advantage over the behemoth, your build will pretty much never deal the same amount of damage unless you are fighting the same level and element of the behemoth every time. Also an issue is that these training dummies aren't any particular element. Say that you wanted to test whether or not a Pangar weapon or a Shroud weapon would be better against a Blaze behemoth in a certain situation, you aren't going to be able to fairly compare the two between the unique effect and elemental advantage alone. With all of these issues that the DPS meter in the training grounds has, what can you realistically compare in the training grounds? You can compare the damage that unique effects will deal between neutral matchups, as well as the damage between cells that are able to show up on the DPS meter. However, you can't really compare full builds between one another, as most of them will have some of these prerequisite factors, making the comparisons less accurate. And those are some of the reasons why you shouldn't trust the DPS meter in the training grounds of Dauntless. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, consider leaving a like on the video. And once again, if you enjoy Dauntless content and are not subscribed already, consider subscribing to the channel. Here I post Dauntless content every week, and to stay up to date with all of my content here on YouTube and on Twitch, as well as keep up with my Hunt Pass giveaways, join the Discord server in the description. I manually make a post whenever I do anything content or giveaway related. I have been Trevor, I go by the Mr. Trails, and I will catch you guys next time.